One Question is designed to give subscribers valuable insights on how executive leaders in college athletics think about key issues on their respective campuses, in their departments, or within their leagues and conferences.
Greetings, this is Ty Brown and welcome to One Question, where we highlight executive leaders in college athletics. Our guest today is Dr. Christy Glass. Christy is a professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Anthropology at Utah State University. Greetings, Christy. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ty, for having me.
Now, Christy, you've been there at Utah State since 2005, and you've done a number of research projects, and actually some of them involve sport and involve corporate in terms of diversity, inclusion, gender, and racial issues that we see in our society. One of the projects you've done is about the glass cliff. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means and the research you've done that ties to college athletics?
Sure. We wanted to understand, we know there are a lot of barriers to women and people of color achieving top leadership positions, but we wanted to understand under what conditions can those barriers be overcome? Under what conditions are women and people of color put in top leadership roles? And so we analyzed this over time. We analyzed 30 years of the appointment of head coaches in the NCAA Division I men's basketball, and we analyzed the appointment of CEOs in the Fortune 500 over a 15-year period. And what we found was that black coaches, minority CEOs, and women CEOs were much more likely than white men to be appointed during times of crisis or when their organizations were at risk to fail. This is a phenomenon known as the glass cliff because it's kind of an invisible set of challenges that sets women and minority leaders up to fail. They're appointed during times of crisis. They're expected to dig their companies or their organizations out of crisis. And if they're not able to do that in a really short time, we find they're replaced by white men, a phenomenon we term the savior effect. In other words, you're given this one high-risk chance to prove yourself. And if you can't do that really quickly, we're gonna blame you for the crisis, and then we're gonna replace you.
That study is interesting. In terms of coaches, I worked for a long time with the American Football Coaches Association, and when you talk about black coaches and an opportunity comes, and you're weighing whether or not to take the opportunity, there are a number of different factors. You're like, well, this is an opportunity, head coaching opportunity to take, especially if it's at the FBS level. Absolutely. But then you're also thinking, they may be in a bad state now, and that's where your ego kicks in. Yeah. Like, you know what, I think I can fix this problem here. But what you're saying is, you're going into a losing situation, and if you lose, I know specific football, and your research may show in terms of basketball, that may have been your only shot at a head coaching position. That's right. It's very interesting.
Yeah, we're asked, so why would individuals accept these offers? And I think you nailed it, Ty. The fear for women and people of color is another opportunity like this might not come along. This may be my one shot to prove what I'm capable of. And whereas white coaches or white executives may have the luxury of turning these high-risk crisis jobs down. But what's really interesting about our research is that for those folks who do make it to the top, including in glass cliff situations, they're often highly skilled and prepared to actually do the job and to do the job well. So we've been pretty amazed at the ability of individuals to come into those situations. And those situations, when you come into a losing team or when you come into an organization in crisis, that only increases the visibility, the scrutiny, the performance pressure that you face. And we've been amazed at how skilled many of these glass cliff leaders have been in actually successfully navigating their organization out of crisis. And to me, this speaks to the fact that these individuals, maybe crisis is the silver lining of the glass cliff, is that it actually gives these extremely talented leaders an opportunity to prove what they can do.
Right, to show off the talents they do have, right? Now, we're here at the 2019 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, and you just gave a presentation. In your presentation, you talked about how leaders can emphasize inclusion, right? Emphasize diversity and emphasize inclusion when putting together their staff or when hiring or when developing a culture for the organization. I wonder, does some of your research give recommendations for how leaders can do that, and some of the things you talked about there in your presentation?
Yeah, for me, the fundamental question is about talent. How can organizations be making sure that the most talented individuals, regardless of race or gender, are rising to the top? Our organizations are better when talented people don't face barriers to mobility. So I'm really concerned about what organizations can do to actually increase opportunity for really talented leaders who are women and people of color. And a couple of the strategies are, make sure that you're relying on objective evaluation criteria. Too often in our organizations, we're going with our gut. We're going, just kind of an abstract, subjective notion of fit, or we're just relying on people within our own networks to recommend candidates for a job opening. And what we do when we do those, and when we don't rely on objective criteria, is we're systematically cutting out or disadvantaging some people who could be really transformative in growing our organization. So start with, making sure that when you're recruiting and evaluating, promoting people, you're using objective, rigorous evaluation criteria, and you're applying the same criteria to all your candidates. The other thing is, one thing that really is known to really change organizations is being transparent about where you're at. So looking at where you are in terms of recruitment, hiring, and promotion, identifying those areas where you could be doing a better job, create a timeline, be transparent with others in your organization about what your priorities are, make a timeline, and make sure people are accountable for actually, having success within the timeline.
Now, I've talked to a lot of athletic directors and a lot of leaders, and they talk about hiring for culture or hiring to fit. And one of the things you mentioned up there was don't hire to fit. Or if you do, make sure you define what fit is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. We all trust our gut. The problem is when we all trust our gut, we tend to make mistakes. We tend to make errors. We tend to see the world through our own assumptions and biases and stereotypes. So the more we can create evaluation practices that rid us of that. And fit is one of these really tricky things where I hear it all the time in hiring committees and all the time in organizations. But what you mean by fit may not be what I mean by fit. And what none of us may agree on what we actually mean by fit, but we're all using the term fit to mean something. So I think organizations are strengthened when we actually have to define what we mean by fit. And when we have those conversations, we start to identify those skills, those experiences, those abilities that really matter for strengthening our organizations. And if we can have those conversations and actually start to systematically identify what those criteria are that make somebody a fit to be successful in our organization, then we can hold every candidate up to that set of criteria. Then that criteria becomes measurable, becomes objective, becomes something that we've all agreed upon, as opposed to kind of a fuzzy,
a nebulous term.
Exactly.
So I wonder the term fit. Recently, over at Athletic Director, we published an article by Jen Cohen, who's the athletic director at University of Washington, and she talks about hiring for culture, right? Mm-hmm. So I'd imagine that in terms of knowing what fit is, if your culture is defined, then the fit is someone who fits into this culture.
That's right. Yeah, we all know culture really matters. Whether this is a good cultural fit for you or not can be the difference between somebody who's successful and somebody who's not successful. None of us want to hire somebody who actually disrupts the organization in a way that's not productive. So when we talk about culture, what I mean by culture may not be what you mean by culture, but if we have the conversation about what that actually means, two things can happen. Number one, we can create more solidarity within the organization by having conversations about what aspects of culture really matter to us and what aspects of culture we believe make our organization stronger. That can only lead to increased engagement and solidarity within the organization, but it also provides us this really important tool with which we can evaluate candidates for whether they're going to contribute productively to the organization or not.
For the sake of terminology, are we talking about the same thing when we say the person didn't fit or this person wouldn't work well in our culture? Are we using the same definitions for those two terms?
Well, if you and I sit down and agree about what culture means and how to measure it, then we can have a rubric and we can look at the same candidates, and we're probably going to rank the candidates the same because we're using the same evaluation criteria for the candidate. If, on the other hand, we haven't had the conversation, we haven't kind of enumerated what we mean by culture, and I meet with a candidate and you meet with a candidate, she may seem like a great fit for me and a poor fit for you, and then we're nowhere.
Okay, so it does translate, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Culture and fit, it all translates. The key is make sure you understand how you're defined. Everybody needs to know how you're defined.
Right.
On the committee, on the whoever's doing the hiring, whoever's doing the evaluation and the filtering needs to understand what is the culture here so that it's not a nebulous term.
Yeah, and it boils down to what are those skills, experiences, credentials, characteristics that we have decided in advance of evaluating candidates that we believe are going to meet the needs of our organization.
Circling back to the coaches, how should they? Well, I don't know if your research tells you this, but if somebody calls me about a job, coach, athletic director, how do I evaluate? I mean, if I look at it and say, they haven't won in a long time, they don't give any money, it's not supporting recruiting, I have to have 9 coaches instead of the full 10 or something along those lines. Like, how should they evaluate whether or not they should take it if this may be the only opportunity they get?
Well, I could speak to that a little. I've spent several years interviewing folks who've made it to the top under these kind of glass cliff situations, and I've talked to them, both CEOs of color and women, about how they understood that crisis moment, how they understood that job opportunity. And one of the things I've heard is really interesting. I've heard from minority executives and women executives that from the very start of their career they were highly visible, but often they were highly visible for the wrong reasons. They were highly visible because they were different from the majority, and that they experienced a lot of scrutiny and a lot of hypervisibility and a lot of pressure because they stood out because of their race and gender. And so they decided early on in their career that they were actually going to pursue high-risk opportunities as a way to establish their leadership credibility. So what they told me is very early on, they decided they were going to keep going after these high-risk, high-reward opportunities so that by the time they get the job offer, they're ready. They've led through crisis before. They've taken on high-risk leadership roles before. They have the skill set that's going to allow them to navigate that organization or that team through the dark, so to speak. The problem with that strategy is it's really high risk. So if you're appointed to the head coach of a losing team and you're the first black coach that team's ever had, you're under the spotlight. Everybody's watching you, and everybody's going to watch you to see what you can do. And there are many aspects of leading a team that are out of your control. And so in a short period of time, if you're not able to turn that team around, it's not just, that was a bad team, it didn't work out. It's that black coach may not have what it takes to be successful.
I don't know if that person fits here.
Yeah. And the risk is not just that you might lose this job. The risk is that might derail your career over the long term.
Interesting insight. I have one final question here, and it ties to something you said in your presentation. If I am not in a leadership role, but I want to engage my supervisor or the people who are in leadership roles about can we bring some more people here in this office that look a little different than everybody else? you talked about engaging management. Talk about that a little bit. And for people who may be listening who, aren't in a leadership role, but may not have influence, but they can possibly do something about it. And what is that engaging management thing?
Absolutely. So there was a session yesterday, and they were talking about how conservative managers can be in protecting the status quo and keeping doing things because they've done it this way forever, and middle managers can actually be some of the most conservative, hard to change pieces of the organization. And I think the way to engage managers is to convince them of the costs of not being serious about inclusion. The benefits, by now we have so much evidence that diversity and inclusion transforms organizations in ways that strengthen the organization. Organizations that have diverse leaders have stronger relationships with their communities, are more innovative, are more creative, have more diverse ties to suppliers and other organizations, are more equitable for all workers, are more sustainable, are more socially responsible. So the evidence of the benefits of this are so huge, which means that the costs of not getting serious about diversity and equity are also huge. So I think one of the ways to motivate managers is making sure they know what's at stake, making sure they know that to achieve their goals, they are not just limited, but actually significantly handicapped when it comes to actually moving their organizations forward, unless they can guarantee that they're recruiting, hiring, and promoting the most talented individuals. And the only way to guarantee that is to be really serious about diversity and inclusion.
So how do you suggest engaging them?
Yeah.
Let me take that question a little deeper. If we are in an organization that is successful, right, and may lack diversity, or even if they are diverse, they don't include the inclusion part in terms of making decisions and having influence within the organization. How do you engage a manager if you're a leader or if you're someone who is supervised by this manager about the benefits of diversity if their retort could be, we're very successful now?
We don't need it.
Exactly. So talk to me about that.
So I have a couple strategies, and this is something that I've been trying to do at my own university. Tell your managers what your competitors are doing. One of the strongest motivators for change is copying the best practices of your competitors. Absolutely. So do a little legwork and find out what some of your competitors are doing and say, hey, look what they're doing. If we could do this, we could be moving ahead. So constantly making your managers aware of not just what your competitors in your immediate environment are, but also other highly visible, successful organizations. So if you're in college football, talk about what the Spurs are doing, right? Talk about what Nike's doing, right? Be bringing those resources to your management, because most of the time managers are like the rest of us. They've got, they're just looking at the thing right in front of them. And if you're bringing strategies, best practices, ideas, comparing yourself to their competitors, you're doing them a favor because you're actually handing them strategies and tools so they don't have to be doing that research themselves.
It's not just lip service, right?
That's right. And let them know what we now know about what the best organizations are doing. So even if you're successful now, imagine where we could be if we were serious about diversity. Imagine where we could be not just now in the short term, but in the medium and long term, if we had a truly diverse leadership structure and we had the benefit of all of those perspectives, we were bringing all of those perspectives to bear on facing the challenges that we have.
And let's not be content with where we are today, right? Yeah. Exactly. Well, Christy, this has been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate you joining us here on One Question.
Thank you so much, Ty.
That was Dr. Christy Glass. She's a professor of sociology at Utah State University. And of course, this is Ty Brown with One Question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of One Question is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.